Hey, and welcome back to Herb Leathercraft. Today what I'm going to be going over is some of the tools that you'll require, and then we'll go over the project itself. Start to finish, I'm going to fast forward some of this. Bear with my video editing abilities. I'm new to pretty much all of this, so we'll get to it and hopefully all goes well. Well, hey guys, how's it going? Sorry I'm interrupting here, but this is taking a little longer than I was expecting, so I'm actually going to have to break this into a two-part series. So the first thing I'll discuss today is the leather that we're going to use. This is a nice, I think a 10-ounce leather, nice and thick, perfect for making belts. This is the last scraps of my first hide that I used. I'm going to be getting another one because I find belts very easy to make, easy-ish to make. Like I said, you can make them as challenging as you like. So a nice thick leather as a base makes it so that you can make a nice belt with no real issues. I'm basing this off the friend's old belt, so I have some of the hardware so I can base it off of, and then we'll go to the rest of the tools. I have my knife, mostly going to be using that for skiving off some material today, as well as my edge tool, my beveler, and some stitching punches. So for the stitching punches I'm going to use today, probably the 6-prong and the 2-prong for any corners. I'm also going to use my stitch line tool as well. I finally found a utility knife. I'm going to use some scrap leather just for practicing before I actually get on to the actual belt itself, if I want to do any punch marks or anything to test. My signature stamp that I'm going to be using for now. I have some of the hardware from the old belt. Again, like I said with belts, I reuse a lot of the old hardware because generally people that have worn out a belt liked the belt style, so why not reuse what's already there? You don't have to purchase new stuff. I'm going to do some stitch work on this one. That's not something I normally do on a belt unless I'm stitching pieces together. As well as our slicker. I'm going to use the slicker today to make the edges nice. May also shine up some of the leather surface. I have my punch, hole punch. That's going to be to make the holes for the belt. Now when I do this, I always make sure that the hardware actually fits in that hole. And we'll show you some tips on that later. Now, to get a nice crease, sometimes I use a gouge tool, and that takes out a nice strip of leather so that you can get a better fold. Pair that with your bone creaser, and you'll get a nice, flush, perfect fold. Now, depending on how this goes, I may end up using some of my design punches there, or shading punches. We'll just have to wait and see how it goes and how much detail we want to put into this. Generally, I also like to personalize the belt for the person getting it, so I may either add a name or just some initials. Other than that, this is going to be my die pan, as well as the sponge that I use for large project dyeing, and you're always going to need a little bucket of water. I only have a little bit in there right now, but I'll get some more. Like I said, scraps. We've also got our needles that I'll use later on for the stitching, and welcome to Herb Leathercraft. Okay, so now that I've got my coffee, I've already cut the belt blank, as well as shaped the edge. So that's just using either utility knife, razor blade, or a cutting tool like this. Sorry I did that off camera. Next time we do a belt, I'll show you how to use the strapper, etc. But we'll carry on into actually making the belt. So generally, the first thing I like to do is put on a stitch line. So for this one, I'm going to stitch line the entire length. I'll show you how to do that. Okay, so what I'm doing for my stitch line here is using my stitch line tool. And I've set it to a distance that's going to let me do some tooling work on the outside of the belt. I'm going to zoom in a little here so that you can actually see what I'm doing. And I'm basically going to start on one edge, and I'm going to run it all the way across. Nice even pressure. Make sure that you're doing this all the way around, and these edges can be interesting. I'm actually going to stop there and come in from the other side just to make sure. Now, when you're doing this sort of thing, if you do make small errors, a lot of it you can cover up. So at the end here, I'll start again, work my way across this way, and I try to do it in one complete motion so that you don't end up with start-stop lines, which you'll notice on some of my initial projects as I was really learning the very basics. Now I'm going to go right to the end, because this end here will eventually be turned over with the hardware running through it. But we'll get to that later. So that looks pretty good. If you look in here, if it'll focus nicely, I've got a nice even edge all the way along. So there's going to be tooling work on the outside line here. We'll get to that later. So, stitch line is done. So now that we're back, a lot of the times what I'll do is I'll use the basis of what they came to me with, and I'll get at least their measurements. Now this one looks like it was worn at the last hole, so I do want to make it at least a couple inches longer than it was. So now that I've measured off the length that I want, I'm going to use my straight edge and my razor blade. I'm going to draw it across once, draw it across twice, and that should be the final cut. Notice I'm doing it on a self-healing pad. That is a wonderful investment for leatherwork. Now I'm going to keep this scrap just in case I want to practice some tooling, or I may end up making the hardware that originally came with this belt. So I am going to try to do that belt hardware edge that they had on it. So I'm just going to reuse that leather that I had cut off on the end of the belt blank itself, and I'm going to see about how much I'm going to need, because I'm also going to want a loop, belt loop, and it's going to have to mount. So that's probably good there. So I'm just going to do a quick score. Try to get it cut straight. Hope my head's not in the way. And I'm going to draw my way through. So I'm going to fold it in half, and I'm going to do a quick crease with my bone creaser. It's not perfectly straight, but that's where the gouge tool comes in. So I'm going to
take out some material. About 3 strips there. Make sure it's even the other way. And then I'm going to use a French skive to actually spread this out a bit. Now this is a very cheap French skive right here. So it's just got a cutting area here and it's flat. So what this lets me do is take away some material around that crease. To make it so that it folds over a little nicer. Now always use sharp tools, so I probably should have stroked this a little bit. But you'll see the more we do this, the easier this gets. I may actually skive in this way. Now, when using sharp tools, always be careful on not cutting yourself. Okay, I'll be back in a bit when that's done, but you can see what I'm doing there. I'm slowly edging it off so that it will fold over nicely. So I'm going to clean up the edge and then shape it a little bit. So, cleaning edges, I like to take my razor blade and just run it along the edge gently to take off any excess material. Be very careful when using a razor blade. They're extremely sharp. And never use a dull razor blade. The chances of cutting yourself with a dull razor blade are tenfold, at least. Okay, so now that I have that thinned out enough that it'll fold over fairly well. You don't have to have it so it folds over perfectly, because when this is in there, it's gonna need that room to swivel anyway. So now I'm going to come up with the shape, because the bolt is going to go roughly here. I'm going to shape it around. So I'm going to use a marking tool, roughly mark the center, and then I want to bevel it out a bit. So, maybe like that. Now again, this doesn't have to be perfect. You just want it to look nice once it's done. I'll put my razor blade back, move some of my tools out of the way. I'm actually going to use a awl to mark that a little deeper. And then lots of little cuts. So I always try to do straight line cuts. They're much easier to cut than a curve. So lots of small cuts, and we end up working that radius in. So that's not bad. Now to get those edges nice, I will go back to my razor blade and I will trim it up. A little bit there. Okay, so there we go. We have a nice rounded edge. There's also going to be a bolt hole, which is quite small, but what I'm going to do is mark that on either side. So with my awl, I'm going to mark the center, and I'm going to try to get most of the way through. Check the other side, not all the way through yet. There we go. So now I have where my hole is going to be punched for that on both sides. So then I'll get to punching a small hole for the hardware. So this is it. What I'm going to do is try to match that up. It's a little small and this might be just too big, which is good because then that'll sit inside the hole without it interfering. So, find my hole, grab my mallet, tap, and tap. So I'm going to move it over to my punch board so that I don't actually damage my self-healing mat too much. I've done it a few times by accident. So holes are punched. I know that that'll fit nicely. I may have to skive off the edges a bit so that it comes in a little closer, but that's not a big deal. So to skive the edges, generally I'll use a knife, my cutting knife like this. Start at a point. So I'll start at an edge and just slowly cut it out. And then the same on the other side. There we go. That'll fit nicely together. And then, like I said, just clean up those edges. Get rid of the fur. Not actually cutting the material, just cutting the excesses off. Okay, clean up the workspace a bit. Have a look. Oh yeah, that's gonna fit together nicely. And hopefully that should give me plenty of room to go through. Okay, so the little belt is gonna fit in between. Now I need to punch a hole for tang to come through from the belt. So I want to mark the center, and I am looking at right here. Looks pretty centered. I'm going to take an oblong punch, and I'm going to punch here, but I'm going to do that over on my punch board. Okay, so I've got that punched, and now let's make sure that it's wide enough. So I'm going to feed it through. There you go. That's going to be our belt loop. So that piece is pretty much finished, minus some of the edging, but I'm going to do that all at once, the beveling and everything. So now to move on to the main belt itself. Okay, so with the way that we're going to do this, I'm going to need to attach that belt hardware to the belt itself in a nice way where it'll swivel. So I'm going to have to skive off quite a bit of material from this end to have it thin enough where it'll actually mount in well. So I'm going to mark it off. Make some room for the end of the belt here on my table. It'll be nice once I get that other workbench all sorted out. So I'm going to mark out where the hole is with my awl. Center that. I need to punch that hole. So now that that hole's punched, I know I need to skive off the material off the back so that it fits in. So I'm going to start from about here. I'm going to skive it quite thin. So I'm actually going to use a gouge tool real quick, just so that I get an idea of how thin I need to go. And then skive off the end nicely. So make it down to about the depth that I'd like to go. And you'll see I have to flip the belt a lot just because of its length. So a little deeper. But you don't want to go right through the material. So that's going to bring me down to probably 2 millimeters. So I'm just going to start skiving off the end. Skiving can be fairly tough if your tool's not as sharp as you'd like, and that's definitely where I'm sitting at. Again, this is where higher quality tools will help you. Okay, so I think that's probably thin enough. I'll clean this up off screen and we'll get back to it. Okay, so next we're going to move on to belt holes. So generally I want to leave at least 2-3 inches on the end so that you at least have a little bit of a flap. On this I might actually even go 3.5 or 4 inches. But the nice thing about these cutting mats is they've also got measurements. So I'm going to mark out some belt holes. So I'm going to go over 1, 2, 3. Let's go 3.5 inches. And I'm going to mark my first center hole. And then generally you want to go every inch. So I'm just going to make enough that it is adjustable. So that's 3 inches of adjustability there. I'll probably leave it at that. And then I am actually going to bring over a punch mat so I can show you punching. Generally I do this on a mat like this, but I also use a granite block below it. So again, we've already figured that in order for that belt hardware to fit in, I'm going to use a punch roughly that size. I have some wax here. So the nice way to do this would be actually wax your project, but you don't want to apply it directly to the material. So generally I just put a little bit of wax on the punch itself, line up my hole, take my mallet, and it should just take a couple decent whacks. A little harder because I don't have the granite block underneath. There you go. And there you go. That is 3 inches of, actually 6 inches of adjustability. So punch hole every inch, 6 holes. So now we'll move on to edge beveling. Edge beveling's pretty easy. I think mine is a number 2. There it is. So it's just got a little cutting groove in the middle. And then I start at one end, maintain the same angle. Sometimes it's hard to get it going. Try not to run it over the top or you'll make a little mistake like that. But once you find the angle, just maintain it and run it along that edge all the way down in one continuous motion. Okay, you'll see I slipped a few times. On the back, it's not such a big deal. You really don't want to do it on the front of your material. It'll leave marks that the dye will actually go into, and it can make the project look not as nice as when you did it. Okay, so now that all my edges are beveled, we'll end up moving into slicking. Now, normally I would do this with dye, like I said before. But what we're going to do is I'm going to get my bowl of water, clean water. Okay, now I'm going to use 1/2 of my sponge to wet the edge all the way along. And I'm going to start with one side and work to the other. So now, this is one where I like to do it sitting down. I'll take my slicking tool and I'll start on one of the grooves and just start rubbing. Fairly hard pressure, doesn't have to be crazy. More uses the heat generated as well as the friction with the wood itself. I'm just going to do a small spot here for you first. Now I like to try to run it through pretty much all the grooves to as small as you can get, just to get the full edge covered, and I'll show you what that does. that ensures. So here's our original leather edge here. And this is what it looks like when it gets slicked. Nice and shiny. It's actually almost waxy, like a hard, nice edge. And you'll see that it darkens up quite a bit. So the edge darkens up as you go. And then there's where we've slicked. So I'll carry on and do the rest of that. Looking really good. Nice and smooth. Nice smooth edge all the way along. Nice and waxy looking. I might do a little more work on a few pieces here and there, but that's starting to look real good. I'll also do the other side. I'll do that off screen so that you're not watching me fast forward too much here. But we'll see you in a few. Okay, so now all of my edges are finished, but so far that is good for slicking. So slicking is actually a little time consuming with this. There is a an attachment you can get for like a grinder, and it'll speed up the process. I don't really want to fork out money, number one, for a grinder, number two, for the attachment. So now we'll move on to stitch work and tooling. So the stitching I'm going to do is going to run up this stitch line, and it's just going to be a basic saddle stitch all the way up and back, and it's more just going to be decorative. Now I have to think of what kind of colored dye I'm going to be using. So I'm going to use a really dark dye, because the original belt was actually black and he wants it dark. Right now I'm probably going to get it to about that color, which will be nice. So I'm going to pick out the stitching that I want. So I think I'll actually go with that light thread. So I'm going to start with the hole right at the tip, and I'm only going to use the 2-prong punch for this to start. And again, if you can, make sure it goes through and wax your tips. So I'm going to keep wax handy just to give it a wipe. Then I match up the first hole with that. Tap. 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 Then once I hit the straight, I'll switch to the 6-prong and speed it up a little for you. Okay, so stitch lines are done on this one half. I'm gonna finish the other half and the end piece as well, and I'll meet you back in a few minutes. Okay, so all my stitch lines are done on the belt, as well as the tool piece, or hardware piece I should say. The only thing I forgot to mention before was I like to slick just quickly any holes that are going to have anything going into it. As well as trying to get a little bit of a slick on the slot. Without compressing it down too badly. Oops. We're running out of the slot like I just did. And I'll do that on the belt loop holes as well. I may just do some shading work. But in order to do that, I have to wet my sponge, wet my leather, let it dry a bit. So I'm going to wet everything all at once, just so that I can hammer through it later. I'll start with the little piece, that way if I don't like it, I can change my mind. Okay, so now that it's dried a little bit, what I'm going to use is this. It's more of a shader, but I'm going to try it out. And I'm going to just go along this entire edge. Sorry, hit you there. Just for some texture. So you can see that texture work just on the edge. Just brings a little bit of a shadow to it. So I'll do that to both sides. There we go. Yeah, I think that's a good look. I think I'll do that to the rest of the belt. So let's carry on. I'll probably start right at the tip. And then work my way around. Okay, so as you can see, we did all that. Just checking my edge, still looks pretty good. Okay, so that part's done. We've got the punch work all along the edge done, just for some texture. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is my signature mark. I generally do that on the back so that it's not too visible for most people. So again, that is simply wetting the piece of work where you're going to place it. Taking your signature piece. And this is actually pretty wide on this. Try to center it. Okay, we got a good impression. So that is good to go.
But I look forward to seeing you in part 2 of this series, so we'll see you soon.